So, good morning. I want to kind of start out a little bit by telling you about how I got into standing on the stage. Nancy came up to me a few months ago and said, "We have some open spots. Would you like to speak?" And I said, "Sure." And Nancy does this full well knowing that I don't, like most speakers, I don't tend to write my things down. Like most speakers here will write their what they're going to talk about down, kind of outline it. And that's just never come natural for me. So she comes up to me about 2 weeks ago and she says, "Now, Shawn, if you know Nancy, you can see her going, now, Shawn, I know you don't like to write things down necessarily, but we want to post this online. So we'd really like to have, even if just maybe you could do a bullet list for us." And I said, "Sure." And then I went, "Oh no." Because that requires me to really plan this out. And I've realized over the years that that's not how my brain works. I've kind of marched to the beat of my own drummer in a lot of respects as to things like that. And what I discovered back in 2010, as I was beginning my journey as an entrepreneur, was that one of the ways that I became very comfortable in front of groups was to go out for late night walks. And it would be funny because it would be a little bit darker. And the freedom of a night walk at around 10 p.m. when no one's really out paying attention is that you can walk 2 or 3 or 4 miles and you can talk to yourself and nobody's there to care. Right? Except for the people I'm sure were watching that I didn't know. So, and the other great thing about that is you can be expressive. So imagine me at 10 o'clock or so at night out in the neighborhood walking, talking to myself completely out in the open, as if I'm speaking in front of a group of 1,000 people, and being expressive too, moving my arms and getting comfortable with how this is going to feel so that when I walk up on a stage I can talk. And that was kind of the challenge I was presented with when Nancy approached me and said that she would really like to have this bullet points. And so I wouldn't blame her if she's frustrated with me right now. I would be. Elizabeth back there at the soundboard works with me almost every day, and she knows the level of, that she has to deal with when it comes to things like that and how I am with that. I tell you that, though, for a reason. And the reason is that as I began my life as a small child, I kind of remember my spiritual journey being very much the same way. I was very young when I was brought into the church. Now, let me give you some background. My father's side of the family, not necessarily very religious, so to speak. Not religious, but just not very practicing religious. And my mother's side of the family, kind of the opposite. Go to church every Sunday, Wednesdays if you're having a really good week. So I remember being very young, and they put me in between the pews down here. And my grandmother, my mom's mom, would sit, and she would feed me sticks of gum while I played with whatever puzzles and things like that to keep me entertained. And I had no idea what the preacher in the background was yelling about, but apparently he was very passionate about whatever it was. And the adults seemed to be very interested in it, but I really couldn't grasp it at the age of 4 or 5. And then I remember going into the Sunday school side of things, and a little bit older, and sing along if you know it, "Jesus loves me, this I know." And it was this mystical world of Jesus and the Bible and Noah's Ark and all kinds of crazy mystical things. And it was very fantasy-based for a child that was about 7 or 8 years old, but this is how the world was. And so that was kind of my beginnings as starting to understand what was expected from me in the Christian faith. Now, as a preteen, I got a little bit older, and I started having, how if you got preteens or teenagers, you know how kids get. And we started coming into our own, and I was starting to listen to, back in the 80s, it was the hair band music, the rock and roll, the evil music. And that was kind of the mantra in the church, that this music was bad and it would lead you down a bad path if you did it. And so I began hearing that in my ear. And I was, at that age, starting to develop some struggles with relationships in my immediate family. And I was hearing that as a mantra in the background that maybe it's the music you're listening to, Shawn. Maybe the fact that you want to become a musician and you want to play that kind of music, maybe that's not a good path for you. And so I was kind of set out in this predestined way that if I kept doing that, I would be going down a bad path with God. I would be going down a bad path with myself. And who knows where I would end up. Maybe I would end up on drugs or, in and out of the jail system because I just hadn't been shown the right way. And it was at that point I remember that, not consciously, but subconsciously, I made a push away from the church. I made a push away from God. I did not make a push away from my spiritual connection to a greater power, but I made a push away from religion. And that was a very fundamental piece of my life. Much like, how I told you I'd become comfortable with speaking in front of an audience was kind of how I became comfortable with accepting what spirituality meant to me. I had to march to the beat of my own drum at first and really take into my own what that meant. And so I traveled down this path for 40-some years now. And I'm a little older, and I've come to realize that as I've paid more attention and become more self-aware, that the spiritual connection is everywhere. The spiritual connection has been following me since I was a child, since I was old enough to remember, until this very day as I walk out here in front of you. Nancy, if you're watching, I don't know, okay, so we have the camera down here, so if you're watching, I'm really sorry. I literally just finished up this talk last night at 10:30. So, but the reason is because I allow myself to come into that moment fully and really let God speak into what I needed to speak about. Now, one of the interesting things that I've learned along the way about myself is that the more self-aware I become, the more obvious these things become to me. And I look out and I start to see things as opportunities in life, even some of the, and you've heard me talk about this, even some of the worst things that could possibly happen, some of the bad, negative sides that life has dealt me. I begin to look at those and I say, what is the opportunity that I'm being given here? And how does that connect to a greater spiritual connection? And so in the past year or so, I've come across the Tao Te Ching, written approximately 2,500 years ago, about 400 BC. And this has really opened my mind to what this may mean to me and how I can find some connectedness in this universe. Lao Tzu was the author of this fantastic piece of work. And the Tao Te Ching basically means the way. One of the opening lines says that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The minute that we name God or whatever, we're taking our sight off of the path. The Tao is the way of nature. And so I'm going to read you a few lines, and I want to examine these a little bit with you. These come from the Tao Te Ching. I encourage you to take a look at this if you have not. So here are a few lines. Can you coax from your mind its wandering and keep to the original oneness? Can you let your body become supple as a newborn child's? Can you cleanse your inner vision until you see nothing but the light? Can you love people and lead them without imposing your will? Can you deal with the most vital matters by letting events take their course? Can you step back from your own mind and thus understand all things? Giving birth and nourishing, having without possessing, acting with no expectations, leading and not trying to control is the supreme virtue. And replace virtue there with power. So I've learned a couple of things by examining this deeper. Can you coax your mind from its wandering and keep to the original awareness? Our minds wander constantly, and I love the fact that we had a meditation today. Meditation has been one of the keys for me in the past 4 or 5 years to really begin to center myself and become one with my spiritual connection. It has allowed me the opportunity to filter out all of the noise that happens within my head and become centered on what is truly important. And that's when I begin to find the connectivity between myself and everything around me. It's when I begin to see people as pieces of God. And when I see people as pieces of God, it's really hard to be angry, because then I can start to absorb that I am just like them, a part of God. Can you let your body become as supple as a newborn child? Can you allow everything to happen the way that it's just supposed to happen? Can you cleanse your inner vision until you see nothing but the light? Pulling away from the expectations and seeing nothing but the light of the path that God has laid out before us. Can you deal, and this is probably one of the most difficult because our ego, I love the acronym, edging God out, ego. This is probably one of the most difficult ones because our ego gets in the way. Can you deal with the most vital matters by letting events take their course and without imposing your will? And that has been probably, as I've grown through the past 4 or 5 years of my life, realized that has been one of the most important factors, is allowing whatever is supposed to happen. And my job as a human being is to find the connectivity of the spiritual within every event that happens. So I come to you today not with some grand, here's the answer that we've all been looking for. I don't have that, and if any of you do, I will gladly step aside. I don't think any of us have that. But what we have is the ability to connect with God every single day. So here's what I've learned. I've learned that it's okay not to know. I've learned that it's okay not to know. And that really goes against what I grew up in. Because what I grew up in was, you have faith. And if you don't have faith, then you need to find faith, because your future is pretty dismal without it. It's okay not to know, and that's what I've had to learn and accept about myself. The other thing that I've had to really come full circle with is that every single one of us are a reflection of God. We look out and we see, as simple as it sounds, the scenes of nature. The trees, the flowers, the plants, the buildings, the architecture all came from people who are children of God. And so am I. So as I begin to look around and realize that every single person that I come in contact with has that same spiritual connection, whether they found it, they're looking for it, whatever their journey is. That if I accept and love them as another human being, they are just like me. And last but not least, what I found is that being here at a place like Entry Point over the past, 15 or 16 years now that I've been a part of this community, is that this community has allowed me to find the faith and the spirituality that I needed in my life. It has been a pivotal point in allowing me entrance back into that side of my life, which I blocked out as an early teen. So I'm very grateful to be able to be here today and talk a little bit about something that's different to me. I told Nancy that coming out here and talking about this is actually a little off of my beaten path. I'm good when you want me to talk about, motivation and how to get past all the tough stuff, but when it really comes to the spirituality side, I had to step back and take some very deep breaths and get very real with myself about what this meant. So I appreciate you letting me be a part of that today. And I encourage you that on your spiritual journey, look into the writings that we've talked about today, the Tao Te Ching. Those are available online if you're not familiar with it. Take a look at that. And also begin to look at the connectedness that you have, however you view God. Look at the connectedness that you have with the spiritual side and the spiritual energy of your universe. Thank you guys so much for having me on.